The ship dropped anchor off a low gray coast on the morning of August 18, 1590, and the first thing John White noticed was the silence. No smoke, no voices carrying across the water, no dogs barking, no axe biting into wood, none of the ordinary noise a village makes when 100 people are living and cooking and quarreling inside it. White had been gone for 3 years. He had crossed the ocean twice to get back here, and somewhere on this island were his daughter, his son-in-law, and a granddaughter he had held exactly once, when she was 9 days old. He climbed into the small boat and was rowed toward the shore, and he sounded a trumpet, a signal his people would have known, a sound that would have brought them running. Nothing answered him but the wind. When he finally stood inside the wooden walls of the settlement, the houses were gone, taken down board by board. The little fort he had helped lay out was empty, and there, carved into one of the great upright posts of the palisade, deep into the wood so it would last, was a single word: CROATOAN. No bodies, no blood, no note explaining anything, just a name, and the question that has refused to die for more than 400 years. Where did 117 men, women, and children go, and why did the word they left behind not lead anyone to them? This is the story of the first English colony in the Americas, and how it vanished. Not a legend, not a ghost story, though it has been turned into both. A real settlement with real names you can still read in the old records. Planted on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina in the summer of 1587. It was meant to be the beginning of England in the New World, the seed of an empire that did not yet exist. Instead, it became the country's oldest unsolved disappearance, the case that every American schoolchild hears about and almost no one can explain. For centuries, people assumed the colonists were simply slaughtered, or that they starved, or that something stranger swallowed them whole. But the truth that has slowly come into focus is quieter and in some ways more haunting than any massacre. These people were not taken. As far as the evidence can tell us, they walked away on their own, deliberately, and they left a sign so the one man they trusted could follow them. He never could. The reason he failed has as much to do with the weather and a war with Spain as with anything that happened on that island. To understand how 117 people could leave a single word and then disappear from history, you have to go back a few years, to the men who came before them and to the mistakes that were already poisoning the ground they stood on. Roanoke was not the first attempt. England in the 1580s was a latecomer to the Americas, watching with envy as Spain pulled mountains of silver out of the New World and grew rich enough to threaten all of Europe. Queen Elizabeth wanted a piece of it, but she was careful with money and careful with her own neck. So she did what monarchs did then. She handed the risk to a favorite. In 1584, she granted Sir Walter Raleigh the right to claim and settle any land in America not already held by a Christian king. Raleigh never set foot in North America himself. He sent others. That same year, 2 of his captains scouted the Outer Banks, the long, thin ribbon of barrier islands that guards the coast, and they came home glowing about a green and gentle country, full of grapes and tall trees and friendly people. They also brought back 2 native men, Manteo and Wanchese, who would learn English, sail back and forth across the ocean, and end up on opposite sides of everything that followed. Remember those 2 names. They matter more than almost anyone else in this story. In 1585, Raleigh sent the first real colony. Around 107 men, soldiers and gentlemen and a few specialists, under a hard military governor named Ralph Lane. They were carried over by Sir Richard Grenville, a proud and violent man who set the tone for the whole disaster early. When a silver cup went missing at a native village, Grenville had the entire village burned to the ground over a single cup. That was the relationship these Englishmen built with the people whose land they were living on. The colonists did not know how to feed themselves in this country, and they expected the local CROATOAN people to do it for them. They demanded corn, they demanded labor, and when the patience of the local leader, A man the English called Bygone finally ran out. Lane struck first. He lured Bygone into a meeting and had him killed, then took his head. This was the legacy the next group of settlers would inherit, though most of them did not know it. The 1585 colony lasted less than a year. Starving, frightened, and at war with their neighbors, they jumped at the chance to sail home with Sir Francis Drake when his fleet happened to pass by in June of 1586. They abandoned the place in such a hurry that they left 3 men behind in the field, men who were never seen again. And just days after they fled, Grenville arrived with fresh supplies to find the colony empty. He left 15 of his own men on the island to hold England's claim, gave them provisions, and sailed away. Hold on to those 15 men too. They are a warning that no one read in time. So when the next ships came in 1587, Roanoke was not virgin ground. It was a place where Englishmen had already burned villages, beheaded a chief, and made enemies who had long memories. Into that powder keg sailed John White and his people, and they were a very different kind of colony. This was the part that made them remarkable, and the part that makes their loss hurt. They were not soldiers. They were families. The roster Raleigh approved listed around 115 colonists, and among them were at least 17 women and several children. These were people coming to stay, to build homes and farms, and a town they were already calling the City of Raleigh. John White was their governor, and he was an unusual man to lead such a venture. He was an artist. He had sailed on the earlier expeditions and made watercolor paintings of the native people and the plants and animals of the coast, pictures so careful and so alive that we still study them today as the earliest detailed English images of America. White was not a warrior or a schemer. He was a watcher, a recorder, a man who paid attention to the world. And he had brought his family with him. His daughter Eleanor was on board, married to a tiler named Ananias Dare, and she was heavily pregnant. White was about to become a grandfather on the far side of an ocean, in a country no English child had ever been born in. The plan was never to settle Roanoke at all. The 1587 colonists were supposed to land, pick up the 15 men Grenville had left, and then sail north to the deep, sheltered waters of the Chesapeake Bay, where the soil was better and the harbor could hold real ships. Roanoke was just a stop, but the man steering them, a Portuguese pilot named Simon Fernandez, had other ideas. Fernandez was also a privateer, which is a polite word for a licensed pirate, and the sailing season for raiding Spanish ships was slipping away while he ferried farmers around. When the colonists went ashore on July 22nd to gather the men from the previous garrison, Fernandez refused to carry them any farther. He told them this was where they would stay. We do not know exactly how that argument went, only how it ended. The families were put off at Roanoke, the very island soaked in the bad blood of the last 2 colonies, and the ships would go no farther north. Whatever leverage White had as governor, it was not enough to move a pilot who wanted to go hunting for Spanish gold. The colony was stranded at the worst possible address in America before it had unpacked a single crate. It went wrong almost immediately. When the colonists searched for the 15 men Grenville had left the year before, they found a single skeleton and a ruined, overgrown fort. The rest were simply gone, killed or scattered. A preview of the colony's own fate that no one wanted to read as one. Then the violence found the new arrivals. A colonist named George Howe wandered off alone into the shallows to catch crabs, unarmed, and a party of native men killed him, struck him down with arrows, and finished him with their wooden swords. The message was not subtle. The grudges of the earlier colonies had not died with the men who started them. The settlers were surrounded by people who had every reason to want them gone, and they had been dumped here against their plan, undersupplied, with winter coming. There was one thread of hope, and his name was Manteo. Of the 2 native men taken to England years before, Manteo had stayed loyal to the English. He came from a people called the CROATOAN, who lived to the south on a long island, the English also called CROATOAN, today known as Hatteras. Manteo's people were friendly. They had never made war on the colonists, and the English knew exactly where they lived. Keep that fact in the front of your mind, because everything that comes later turns on it. There was a place these people trusted, a name they knew, a friend who could vouch for them, just down the coast. Within weeks, the colony made a decision that would change everything. They needed help from England, more supplies, more people, more support from Raleigh, and they needed someone to go back and get it. They wanted that someone to be John White. He did not want to go. Leaving meant abandoning his daughter, his new son-in-law, and the granddaughter who had just been born. Because on August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a baby girl, and they christened her Virginia. Virginia Dare, the first child of English parents born in the Americas, White's own granddaughter, a baby who would become a symbol of the whole lost colony, precisely because no one knows what happened to her after the age of 9 days. The colonists pressed White hard. They argued that he carried the most weight with Raleigh, that only the governor returning in person would shake loose the help they needed, that if anyone else went, the supplies might be stolen or delayed. White finally agreed. It was a reasonable decision, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. On August 27, 1587, just 9 days after his granddaughter was born, John White boarded a ship and sailed for England, leaving 117 souls behind on Roanoke Island. He expected to be back within a few months. He had no way of knowing that the entire weight of history was about to fall between him and that shore. Before he left, White and the colonists made a plan, and this plan is the single most important piece of evidence in the entire mystery. They agreed on a code. If the colony moved while White was gone, which everyone expected, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or a post so that when he came back, he would know where to follow. That was the first part. The second part mattered most. If they were forced to leave suddenly, if they were under attack or driven out in fear, they would carve a cross above the name. A cross meant danger. A cross meant come quickly. Something is wrong. We did not go willingly. No cross meant the opposite. No cross meant we left in our own time, on our own terms. No emergency. Follow us when you can. They shook hands on it. White sailed away believing that whatever happened, the people he loved would leave him a message he could read. A sign telling him not just where they had gone, but whether they were in trouble. That agreement is the reason this story is a mystery and not a tragedy with an obvious ending. Because of that one promise, the word carved into the post in 1590 was never just a word. It was the answer to a question White had asked before he left, and the form of the answer mattered as much as the letters. Then the world got in the way. John White reached England in the autumn of 1587 and ran straight into the largest war of the age. Spain and England were on the edge of open conflict, and King Philip of Spain was assembling the greatest invasion fleet Europe had ever seen, the Spanish Armada, more than 130 ships meant to carry an army across the Channel and put England under Catholic rule. Queen Elizabeth needed every seaworthy vessel and every able sailor for the defense of the realm. She forbade ships from leaving English ports. White's relief mission was frozen in place, not because anyone forgot the colonists, but because the whole country was bracing for survival. White tried anyway. In the spring of 1588, he managed to get 2 small ships that were too minor to be drafted into the Navy, loaded them with supplies and a handful of new settlers, and set out across the Atlantic. He never made it. The crews could not resist the temptation to play pirate on the way, chasing prizes for profit, and they ran into other privateers who were better at the game. White's ships were attacked, beaten, and robbed. He was wounded. The vessels limped back to England, stripped of cargo, having traveled the ocean for nothing. The supplies meant for his family ended up in someone else's hold. And then the Armada came, and all of England held its breath through the summer of 1588, while the fate of the kingdom was decided in the Channel. England won that war, scattered the Armada with fire ships and storms, and survived. But the years kept slipping by. It was not until 1590, 3 full years after he had left them, that John White finally found a way back across the ocean to Roanoke. He had to take it as a passenger on privateering ships whose captains cared about Spanish plunder, not about a lost colony, and who treated the detour to Roanoke as an afterthought, to be fitted in around the real work of raiding. They reached the Outer Banks in August. On the night before they landed, they saw smoke rising from the island, and from a nearby island too, and White's heart must have lifted, because smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. The next morning, August 18, 1590, was Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, if she was still alive to have one. White went ashore. What he found was not a massacre and not a graveyard. It was an orderly absence. The houses had been carefully taken apart, not burned, not smashed, but dismantled, the way you take down a structure when you mean to use the materials somewhere else. Around the site, someone had built a strong defensive palisade of large tree trunks, a real fortification that had not been there when he left. The place had been prepared and then emptied on purpose, and on the trees and posts he found the message he had been promised. Carved into the bark of a tree near the entrance were 3 letters, C-R-O, and carved into one of the main posts of the palisade, in full, in capital letters, deep and clear, was the word CROATOAN. White looked, and he understood, and the most important thing about what he saw was what he did not see. There was no cross. No mark of distress above the letters. By the code they had agreed on, that meant only one thing. The colonists had not fled in fear. They had not been driven out. They had moved, in good order, to a place White knew, the home of Manteo's friendly people, the CROATOAN, on the island we now call Hatteras. White was, by his own account, relieved. He believed his family was alive and safe among friends, and he believed he knew exactly where to find them. All he had to do was sail 50 miles down the coast. He never got there. This is the cruelest turn in the whole story, and it is the reason the mystery exists at all. A storm rolled in off the Atlantic, the kind of weather the Outer Banks are famous for, and the ships White was traveling on were in trouble. Anchor cables snapped. They lost anchors. The sailors, who had never wanted to be there in the first place, refused to risk their vessels and their lives sailing into shoal water in worsening weather to chase a colony that was not their concern. They made for the open sea and pointed the bows toward England, and then toward the Caribbean and the Azores to salvage their voyage with plunder. John White, a governor with no authority over the men who carried him, was overruled by the weather and by sailors who would not turn back. He was within a day's sail of the people he had crossed an ocean to save, with a name carved in wood telling him where they were, and he was carried away from them. He never saw Roanoke again. He never saw his daughter Eleanor again, or his granddaughter Virginia. He spent his last years in Ireland, a broken and disappointed man, and around 1593, he wrote a letter to a friend in which he gave up. He committed the fate of the colonists, his own flesh and blood among them, to the mercy of God, and let go of the search. He died not long after, never knowing what became of them. The one man with the will to follow the message had been stopped by a war, a pirate, and a storm, and after him, almost no one tried. That is where the facts run out, and the mystery begins. For more than 400 years, people have tried to fill the silence after that word on the post, and the story has been smothered in nonsense. There are tales of the colonists being eaten, of them turning into deer, of zombies and aliens and curses. None of that deserves your time. But underneath the noise, there are a handful of serious theories, each one supported by real reasoning and real evidence. and each one deserves to be taken on its strongest terms before we pass judgment on what most likely happened. The first and oldest serious theory is the simplest, and it is the one the carved word itself points to. The colonists assimilated. They left Roanoke and went to live with the CROATOAN, Manteo's people, on Hatteras Island, and over the following years and generations they blended into that community until the line between English and native disappeared. Think about how much this theory has going for it. The colonists were stranded, undersupplied, and surrounded by hostile groups, but the CROATOAN were their one reliable ally, and Manteo himself was a bridge between the two peoples. The colonists knew where the CROATOAN lived. They had a friend among them. When you are out of food and out of options, you go to the people who will take you in, and the colonists told White exactly where they were going. They carved it twice, on a tree and on a post, with no distress mark, which by their own agreed code meant a calm, deliberate move to a known destination. The word was not a riddle, it was an address. For most of history, this theory was just a logical inference, the obvious reading of the evidence, but in the last 20 years, it has gained something far more powerful than logic. It has gained dirt. On Hatteras Island, in the old territory of the CROATOAN, archaeologists have been digging into the remains of a native town that was lived in straight through the time of the lost colony and for decades after. And in the soil, mixed in with the native pottery and tools, they have been pulling out European things. Not just a single trinket that could have washed up or been traded once, but a pattern of objects. The hilt of a 16th century rapier, a slender European sword, part of a gun, small lead seals, and counting tokens of the kind English households used. Fragments of slate and a writing tool, the sort of thing a literate English person would carry, not a hunting people. Glass and metal that came from across the ocean. The man who led much of this work, the British archaeologist Mark Horton, has argued that this is not what trade looks like. Trade leaves you beads and bright objects that people wanted. This assemblage looks more like the leftovers of European daily life, the broken and discarded debris of people who were living there, using their own goods year after year. And in 2025, the dig produced its most provocative find yet: hammer scale. Hammer scale is the flaky waste that falls off hot iron when a blacksmith hammers it, the trash of a forge. It is not a trade good, no one wants it. It is what is left on the ground after someone works iron. And the native peoples of the coast did not forge iron. They had no blacksmithing tradition. So the presence of that scale in a native town raises a hard question. Who was working iron there in the 16th century? The most natural answer, Horton argues, is Europeans, living among the CROATOAN, practicing a craft they had brought with them. If he is right, that scale is the fingerprint of the lost colony, ground into the earth of the very island the carved word named. That is the strongest case, but honesty demands we hear the other side of it, because not every expert is convinced. Skeptics point out a real problem with dating. Many of the European objects from Hatteras come from layers of soil that date to the middle and later 1600s, decades after the colony vanished. If that is when they were deposited, then they might not be the colonists' things at all. They could be heirlooms, English goods passed down through native families for 2 or 3 generations. They could be later trade goods that arrived from the growing English colony at Jamestown after 1607. A rapier hilt in the ground does not come with a label saying which Englishman dropped it or when. The archaeologist Charles Ewan has been one of the steadiest voices urging caution. He points out that to truly prove the colonists lived and died on Hatteras, you would want something undeniable, like the foundation of an English forge, or English graves with bodies that can be dated to the right years. And so far, no one has found that. What we have is suggestive, even compelling, but not yet a closed case. That is the difference between a strong theory and a proven fact, and a serious person keeps the two apart. So if not all of them went to Hatteras, where else might they have gone? That brings us to the second major theory, and it goes back to the original plan. Remember that the colonists never wanted to stay on Roanoke in the first place. Their real goal was always the Chesapeake Bay, 50 miles or more to the north, with its deeper waters and richer land. The Chesapeake theory says that the main body of the colony, or a large part of it, eventually made its way north to the bay they had always intended to reach, and settled among the native peoples there, somewhere in the territory that would later become Virginia. This idea is not a wild guess. It comes from a chilling source. 20 years after the colony vanished, the English finally planted a settlement that survived, at Jamestown in 1607, right on the edge of that same Chesapeake region. And the powerful native leader who dominated that area was Powhatan, the father of the famous Pocahontas. According to reports written by the Jamestown colonists, including a man named William Strachey, Powhatan himself claimed responsibility for killing a group of people who had been living among a neighboring tribe, people described as wearing European clothes and living in stone houses. The Jamestown settlers came to believe that Powhatan, shortly before or around the time they arrived, had wiped out the survivors of the Roanoke colony who had been sheltering near the Chesapeake, possibly because his priests warned him that a nation from that direction would rise up and overthrow him. If that report is true, then at least some of the lost colonists did not vanish into peaceful obscurity. They reached the place they were aiming for, lived there for nearly 20 years, and were destroyed almost on the eve of rescue, just before other Englishmen arrived who might have found them. It is a grim possibility, and the evidence is second-hand and uncertain. The words of native informants filtered through English colonists with their own reasons to tell the story a certain way. But it cannot be dismissed, and it points the colony in a completely different direction from Hatteras. And then there is a third strand of evidence that suggests the answer might be both, and neither, all at once. In recent years, researchers studying one of John White's own watercolor maps made an odd discovery. White had painted a map of the coast, and on it, hidden under a small patch that had been pasted over the paper centuries ago, conservators at the British Museum found a tiny symbol drawn in invisible faded ink, the kind of mark used to indicate a fort. It sat at a spot inland, to the west, near the head of Albemarle Sound, far from both Roanoke and Hatteras. Someone, possibly White himself, had marked a planned inland location and then deliberately concealed it, perhaps to keep it secret from rival Spanish or English eyes. Acting on that hidden clue, a group called the First Colony Foundation began digging at the spot, which they nicknamed Site X. And there, miles inland from the sea, they found fragments of a particular kind of English pottery called borderware, the same household ceramic used at Roanoke and at Jamestown, a type that stopped being shipped to America in the early 1600s. The presence of that pottery so far inland hints that at least a small group of colonists, a handful of people, may have struck out to the west and lived for a time at that inland site. It is not proof of the whole colony. The amount of material is small, but it fits a picture that more and more historians have come to accept, which may be the most important idea in this entire mystery. The colony did not have to go to only one place. It could have split. Picture the situation those people were actually in. More than 100 men, women, and children, stranded on a small island, low on food, surrounded by some groups who hated them, and at least one group that did not. They had no single perfect refuge. The CROATOAN on Hatteras were friendly, but lived on poor sandy land that could not easily feed 100 extra mouths. The Chesapeake was richer, but far away, and dangerous to reach. The inland country had its own people and its own risks. The smartest survival strategy for a group that size might not have been to stay together at all. It might have been to break into smaller parties, each one attaching itself to a different native community that could absorb a few more people. A dozen, here on Hatteras, with Manteo's people. a larger group north toward the Chesapeake, a few west to the inland fort marked on the map. If that is what happened, then there was never one lost colony to find. There were several smaller fates, spread across hundreds of miles, each fading into a different native nation, each leaving only scraps. That would explain why the archaeology keeps turning up traces of Englishness in widely separated places, and why no one has ever found the single mass grave or the single abandoned English town that would account for everyone. You cannot find the one place they went, because there was no one place. So what really happened to the 117? Here is where honesty has to do the work, that wishful thinking usually does in stories like this. We cannot say with certainty, name by name, what became of each of those people, and anyone who tells you they have solved the case completely is selling you something. The bodies have not been found. No grave, no skeleton, no diary, no signed confession from Powhatan. Nothing that closes the file beyond all argument. That part of the mystery is real and it is permanent, but that does not mean we know nothing, and it does not mean every guess is equally good. We can resolve a great deal of this, even if we cannot resolve all of it. Start with what we can say firmly. The lost colony was almost certainly not destroyed at Roanoke. There was no massacre on that island, no burned town, no bodies. The settlement was taken apart in an orderly way, and the people left a deliberate, agreed message telling exactly where they had gone, with no distress mark, which by their own code meant a calm and intentional move. So the very premise that has thrilled people for centuries, the idea that an entire colony vanished into thin air without a trace, is wrong. They did not vanish. They left, on purpose, and they told us so. The real reason the trail went cold is not supernatural and not even mysterious once you see it plainly. The one person who was coming to follow that message, John White, was blocked for 3 years by a war with Spain, robbed by pirates, and finally turned back within sight of his goal by a storm and a crew who would not sail. The window to follow a fresh trail slammed shut, and by the time anyone with real interest looked again, 20 years had passed and the colonists had long since folded into the land. The disappearance was not the people. The disappearance was the rescue. As for where they went, the honest verdict is that the best physical evidence we have points most strongly to Hatteras, to assimilation with the CROATOAN, exactly as that carved word said. The European objects in that native town, accumulating over decades, the kind of debris that comes from people living rather than people trading, and now the hammer scale that suggests someone was forging iron where no native blacksmith ever worked. All of it lines up with the plainest reading of the clue the colonists themselves left behind. They told White they were going to CROATOAN. The ground at CROATOAN is full of English things. The simplest explanation that fits the evidence is usually the right one, and here, the simplest explanation is also the one the colonists wrote down before they left. That is as close to an answer as 4 centuries have produced. At the same time, the inland pottery at Site X and the dark report of Powhatan to the north suggest the colony probably did not all share one fate. The most complete picture, the one that honors all the scattered evidence instead of forcing it into a single story, is that the colony broke apart under pressure and survived in pieces, with the largest and best documented piece living out its days among the CROATOAN on Hatteras, and the bloodline of those English families running quietly forward into later generations of coastal people, their origin half remembered and then forgotten. That is the part worth sitting with as we close. The lost colony of Roanoke is famous as a horror, a creepy vanishing, a word carved into wood with no one left to explain it. But look at it clearly, and it is something else. It is a story about ordinary people choosing to live. Faced with abandonment and starvation, 117 English men, women, and children did the most human thing imaginable. They did not wait on a barren island to die for an empire that had forgotten them. They walked toward the people who would take them in. They put themselves under the protection of native communities they had been taught to fear, and they let themselves be absorbed, traded their Englishness for survival, and lived. If that is what happened, and the best evidence says it mostly is, then they were never lost at all. They simply became part of a different story, one that the records of England had no way to follow. Virginia Dare, the baby girl her grandfather held for 9 days, very likely grew up. She would have grown up speaking words that were not entirely English, in a world her parents could never have imagined, among people who had once been called the enemy, and she would have had children, and those children would have had children, until somewhere in the long memory of the Carolina coast, a few faces and a few traditions carried a thread of the first English colony forward without anyone knowing it was there. The real lesson of Roanoke is not that people disappear, it is that history loses people all the time simply because the ones who could have recorded their lives were stopped by a storm, or a war, or 3 years too late. There are no monsters in this story. There is a grandfather who never made it back, a baby who probably lived, a word carved deep into a post that said exactly what it meant, and an empire too busy and too far away to read it. The next time you hear that an entire colony vanished without a trace, remember that the trace was right there the whole time, a single word telling us where they went, and that the only thing truly lost was our ability to follow. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the true ones hiding behind the legends, subscribe and stay with me.